Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday morning. Boy, can you believe it's Thursday already? My goodness gracious, this week has absolutely just flown by. Well, welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And we are involved in a study of 1 Corinthians 15. Got to save my place here. 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul said that the resurrection would be when sin, the sting of death, would be overcome. To deal with sin is to deal with death. It's that simple. It's that profound. It's that challenging. And we've been showing that Romans chapters 5 through 8 is dealing with the same identical issue. Adam, sin, and death. Christ, righteousness, resurrection, life. Direct corollaries, direct parallels. Not two deaths. There is one death under consideration. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered the world, and death, not deaths, plural, but so death passed upon all men because all men sinned. Okay. I've been asking you to consider some very pointed, very challenging, and very important questions in light of Paul's statement in Romans chapter 6, verse 23, where he said, the wages of sin is death. You know, just recently on Facebook, I had one individual challenge me on my views, and he said, well, you see, Romans chapter 6, verses 1 to 10, the first half of the chapter, that's spiritual death, spiritual resurrection. He initially said all of Romans 6 is regeneration, but anyway, kind of backed off of that. And he said, interestingly enough, the second half of Romans chapter 6 deals with biological death. Well, okay then. In Romans chapter 6, and this is not pointed at that one single individual per se, but this is a common view. You see, in reality, there are all sorts of views about Romans chapter 6. There is that bifurcated view that says Paul's talking about two different deaths. He's talking about spiritual alienation and death, and then he's talking about physical. But they encounter and they run into problems on that view. So some say, well, no, he's only dealing with spiritual death in Romans 6, but in 1 Corinthians 15, he's talking about biological death. Folks, there's no proof of that. I mean, all you get is bald assertions without any exegetical proof of that. Paul in Romans is dealing with the death that came through Adam. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered the world, and death through sin. Okay, since Paul is dealing with the death, and it is, by the way, in the Greek, the death entered through sin. And since in Romans chapter 6, he is talking about putting off, i.e., the body of sin, then he is talking about putting away the death that came through sin. That process had begun, as we saw in our last video. But just as Paul said in Romans chapter 6, they had been buried with Christ in the likeness of his death. They would be also in the likeness of his resurrection. And by the way, let me remind you, being buried with Christ in the likeness of his death was not being put to physical death. It wasn't being put on a literal cross and experiencing biological death. Now, if being like Christ in the likeness of his death was not being like him in physical death, then being like him in the likeness of his resurrection doesn't imply, suggest, or demand biological resurrection. But now watch this. Pardon me. Remember that Paul says that when they were buried with Christ by baptism into his death, they put away the body of sin. Well, once again, to put away the body of sin is to do what? It's to put away the body of death. because the wages of sin is death. They had begun the process. They were awaiting its consummation at the day of the Lord. The one who began a good work in you will complete it at the day of the Lord. Okay, now, the wages of sin is death. I mentioned a moment ago a gentleman on Facebook. He told me Romans 6, early part of the chapter, is by a spiritual death. The second half is biological death. Well, that means that Romans 6:23, when it says the wages of sin is death, that means that Paul was saying the wages of sin is biological death. My goodness. We have to ask some really, really important questions here. Let me refine the question to one question. No, I better ask two. If I have time, I'll deal with one, the second later. Is physical death. Now remember, I asked this question before, but I'm reposing it here, and I want you to consider it. Is physical death. Now remember, we're told that Romans 6:23 is dealing with physical death. So is physical death the enemy of the child of God that is forgiven of their sin? Since sin brings death, and the child of God is forgiven of sin, what did Paul say? There is therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus, who do not walk after the flesh, but after the Spirit. Now watch this. Catch the power of this. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has made us free from the law of sin and death. Wait a minute. Whoa, Paul. What's the law of sin and death? It's the law of the garden. In the day you eat, you will surely die. The law of sin and death says, you sin, you die. The law of sin and death was, Adam sinned, he introduced death into the world. All men die because all men sin. Just like Paul said in Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death. So, is biological death the enemy of the child of God that is forgiven of sin the only thing that brings death? Is the child of God forgiven of sin still subject to the law of sin and death? Well, Paul was saying they weren't, but remember, it's an already but not yet. And boy, this is where the futurist camp just goes crazy. I mean, the confusion that is rampant in the futurist camp, and I might add, in all kindness, the confusion that exists in much of the preterist camp in regard to that very issue. Is physical death the enemy of the child of God? If you don't deal with this question properly, then your doctrine of resurrection, your doctrine of eschatology will be completely skewed. Now, since I've gone back over the previous question and spent a little more time on it here, I'm not going to ask the other question. We will save that until next Monday. But here is the question for you to ponder. I hope you'll think about it. I hope you'll study about it. If the law of sin and death means you sin and you die, and if, as we are told, Romans 6 is dealing with biological death, then here's the question. If it is the case that the child of God is forgiven of sin, the one thing that brings death, then why is it that the child of God must still experience physical death? The wages of sin is death. Physical death, we are told. The child of God is forgiven. The law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has set us free from the law of sin and death. Oh, but wait, no, that can't even be right. We are told, because after all, we are all going to die physically. So to revamp the question just a little bit, is the child of God, forgiven of sin, still subject to the Adamic curse? And if so, what did Paul mean when he said, "Thanks be to God who gives us the victory"? Not really, Paul. We can't really say that Christ gives the victory if we still suffer the Adamic curse as children of God. This is serious stuff. And, of course, we've got more. Don't forget, tomorrow we'll deal more with Kenneth Gentry and his book, Have We Missed the Second Coming, as we continue our study of his exegesis of the Olivet Discourse. In the meantime, please get a copy of my book, The Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12 and verse 2, Future or Fulfilled, in which I discuss a tremendous amount of all of these things. And, pardon me, as I have said before, you will be absolutely, completely blown away with really, honestly, how simple it is to prove that biological death has never been the focus of Christ's redemptive work. So, in the meantime, we'll see you tomorrow on the flip side as we continue our discussion of Kenneth Gentry's book.